Hello everyone and welcome back to Heretics and Heroes. With the release of the Horus Heresy Saturnine box looming on the horizon, I thought it would be the perfect time to get mean and green. No, not you. This guy here won me Best in Show at the painting competition at a local gaming convention, and I have had many requests for a video that focuses on his green armor. And this video is going to be just that, but I'm also going to tackle explaining more broadly the concept of volumetric highlighting on miniatures. This is kind of a part 2 to my How Physics Can Make You a Better Miniature Painter video. Whereas that video focused more on the why, this video is going to be more about the how. One of the first and most important steps for volumetric highlighting is going to be deciding on a light source and what direction it's going to be coming from. In a lot of more tabletop-oriented painting, we kind of just assume that we have diffuse ambient lighting and then we just do our shading and our highlights for the sake of visibility of the details. But when we're doing volumetric highlighting, it's much more realism focused, so it's going to help us to choose an actual light source within our fictional model's environment. And for the sake of intuitiveness, I'm going to choose the sun as my light source. And yes, I know that us wargamers have a reputation for being basement dwellers. I am going to assume that you've all seen the sun before, right? As for the light direction and placement on the model, that's a decision that you're going to have to make for yourself. Every model is going to have what's called a golden angle, and all that means is it's the angle at which it's most pleasing to look at. Think about it like this. If I were going to take a display photo of a mini that I just painted, which way would I want to face the camera? And something to keep in mind is that your chosen light placement can sometimes alter what the golden angle is. One good trick for helping you make this decision is using your primed mini as a light map. I don't have any footage of the Space Marine in the just primed state, but I did recruit Nork Deadog to help us out with this demonstration. A lot of primers tends to have kind of a satin or even close to glossy finish, and that's going to be really helpful to us here because if we place the model underneath our painting light and just turn it around and shift the perspective, we're going to see very clearly where and how intensely the light is going to be impacting the different parts of the model and how it's going to be interacting with the different shapes of the model. You can move your painting lamp around as well to test out different lighting scenarios. If you're having trouble finding your golden angle, my recommendation is to have your light source coming in from above and around 45 degrees either off to the left or right. This tends to look very dramatic in the finished product, and if you pay attention, you'll notice that this kind of lighting is used a lot in movies and TV. Once you've made this decision, it may be helpful for you to snap a picture of your model in this primed state with the light shining in the direction that you want. That way, if you're ever unsure on light placement, you have a reference. Now we can go ahead and start mapping out our lighting on the model. Where we start laying down our colors is going to depend on both the shape of that part of the model and the light direction that we've chosen. In the main YouTube video where I painted this model, I talked about the ways in which light falls across different shapes, but if you're ever unsure, you can just refer to that reference photograph that you took. There is one massive pitfall to avoid here though. Don't try and copy the size and shape of the lighting exactly one-to-one from your reference photo. The reason is twofold, the first of which is what I covered in the other YouTube video, which is why I think it's so important that you go watch it. Light interacts with different surfaces and materials in very different ways, so unless you want your entire model to look like it's made out of glossy paint, you're gonna need to adjust your contrast levels and your area of illumination to mimic the type of surface you want to paint. The other reason, which I sadly neglected to cover in my other video, is that the relative size and distance of your painting lamp to your model is going to be much different than that of the sun to your Space Marine. One of the foundational tenets of miniature painting is that we need to simulate light on our model using paint because they're just so small that attempting to rely on ambient light, well, It's just never going to look like a life-size object. In the meantime, we'll use what we learned from the other video to continue building up our highlights. Since I want this armor to look like it is rough, battle-worn armor that has been painted and repainted with a slight semi-gloss finish, we are combining the aspects of both specular and diffuse lighting. This means we're going to have a pretty well-defined line between our shaded area and our illuminated area, and the illuminated side is going to cover a pretty sizable amount of surface area. If that's not immediately making sense to you, you can take a look at this diagram that I produced at the request of one of my patrons. This shows how I like to build volume through a layer-by-layer process. I do want to talk about color choices really briefly. I have a paint list that's already posted on the Patreon, but it's worth mentioning why I made the choices of color that I did. Since our primary light source is going to be the sun, we know that that is going to be a fairly warm yellow light. And since light source affects color perception, that means that our highlights are going to be warm and pushing slightly yellow as well. In order to create nice color temperature contrast, I then went for a very dark, cool base coat to create our shadows. As I move up through my layering process, we're going to be moving into more neutral greens, then into yellow greens, and then finally my highest highlights are going to be a pale yellow. Keeping in mind how your light source is going to change the color perception on the model is really important and can go a long way in selling the realism of what you're trying to paint here. For example, if I wanted this Space Marine to be standing under a blue sun instead of a yellow sun, I would probably highlight into more of a grayish green. So by this point, I have laid down 2 layers on top of my base coat. This has allowed me to build contrast between the shaded and illuminated areas very rapidly while still maintaining a slight smooth transition between the two. Don't really worry too much about blending at this step. That's not super important. It's just getting that light placement. So you can use relatively opaque layers here. If you've seen my video on paint consistency, which you really should go watch because it is the most important skill in mini painting, I would recommend using somewhere between a base and layer consistency here, maybe leaning slightly more towards layer consistency. From here, we need to start really building those volumes. We are trying to depict 3-dimensional shapes, so let's show that dimension. The process is mechanically fairly simple from here. You are just going to go over all of the illuminated areas that you've mapped out and start building some layers of brighter color that is consistent with the underlying shape of the object, just in a more constricted surface area each time you do a new layer. These sort of concentric shapes within a shape within a shape building up to our brightest highlight is how you're going to convincingly render an object. For these subsequent layers, I highly recommend diluting your paint a little bit further, going maybe past layer consistency into somewhere between a layer and a glaze. In addition, when you start laying down the paint, I find it really helpful to use sort of thin, scratchy brush strokes, or maybe even a little bit of stippling to help build up these subsequent layers. This helps to bake some texture into the surface, as well as serving as some preliminary blending. You can think of those 2 brush motions as being very akin to the stippling or cross-hatching that you would learn in a drawing class for shading, except kind of in reverse because we are highlighting up instead of shading down. I also find it very useful to do a bit of edge highlighting during each step of this process. That way you can let your volumes and your edges really work together in terms of intensity to both render the 3D nature of the object while still providing enough definition to the edges of the shapes for them to be visible at this scale. Our brightest highlight is essentially going to be a sharp reflection of our chosen light source. This is why I said that you shouldn't just copy your photo. This is why I said you shouldn't just copy your reference photo of the primed Mini 1-to-1, because it would end up making your light source look way larger and way closer to your Space Marine than it should. While yes, I know that the sun is like 1 billion times the size of a Space Marine, because of the distances involved, it's going to appear comparatively quite small. Therefore, we can make our final specular reflections pretty constrained. At this point in the process, if you've laid down your layers with enough finesse, you may find that you're done. That's all you need to do, no additional blending really necessary. And if that is the case, good job, congratulations, but I always like to go in and do a little bit of glazing, both to smooth things out, but also I find that it is a great way to add back in some vibrancy that is often lost in the layering process. If you don't know what glazing is, I suggest go watching my paint consistency video, but the gist of it is you're going to be just using some really diluted paint and putting on some ultra thin layers, which will begin to erase some of the harsher boundaries between the colors that are underneath it. It'll also act as a little bit of a color filter over whatever surface you put it on, so if you choose a more saturated paint, you're gonna up the vibrancy of the paint job. I always recommend glazing with a darker color over a lighter color. That's why I tend to leave this step for last. I'm not 100% certain on what the technical reason for this is. I just find that the glaze behaves more like I want it to when I use a darker color over a lighter color. My guess is that it's because a lot of lighter miniature paints have some white mixed into them, and white pigments tends to be physically larger than the darker pigments, which naturally makes their finish a bit less smooth. It's up to you to make the decision of how much time you want to spend on the glazing process based on how smooth is smooth enough for you. And that's it, everyone. From here, you can decide if you want to add some weathering, some decals, or maybe some freehand iconography if you're feeling bold. You may have noticed that I've included my face in this video a little bit less often than usual, and that's because this was originally published as a Patreon exclusive, where I typically do voiceover only so that we can focus on the painting. Speaking of which, the YouTube version of this video is considerably shorter than the Patreon version. That's because one of my patrons specifically asked me to include as much uncut painting footage as I could. If that's the kind of thing that you think that you'd be interested in, or you might like some of the other rewards, such as behind-the-scenes updates, a community reference photo library, personalized comment and critique on your miniatures, or even private coaching, then please consider joining my Patreon, which is linked below. Before you click away, I have some big announcements, the first of which is that I'm going to be teaching 6 miniature painting classes at Gen Con 2025. There will be a link below where you can see all 6 of the class topics, as well as purchase tickets. Spots are filling up, so don't miss your opportunity. I really hope to see some of you in person at Gen Con in August. In addition to that, I'm going to be teaching 2 more miniature painting classes at a smaller convention called Ironweld, which is taking place near Boston, Massachusetts. I'll also link that down below. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I'll see you on the tabletop, or better yet, in the classroom.